So basically, my name is Dan Taylor. I lecture at the Open University in the UK, and my background really is Spinoza. And what I'm going to present is a kind of work in progress for something that I've been commissioned to write for early next year. So any kind of guidance, comments, thoughts, really appreciated. Also, by the way, if suddenly my own prompts to make points suddenly appear on the screen, please tell me and I'll get back to the slides. But hopefully I've planned this out okay. Okay, right, so climate anxiety, fatalism, and the capacity to act. So what I'm going to do in this paper is use the recent example of climate anxiety to think about a challenge for personal autonomy, which is where knowledge of how or why one ought to act is overcome by a belief that one lacks the power to control what is conceived as destined or fated. Basically, where fatalism diminishes the capacity to act. So my paper has two parts. In the first, I'm going to introduce the problem of climate anxiety. You may already have experienced this in recent times, but I'll just give us a kind of workable definition. And then in the second part, you're going to enter into my workshop, because we're going to consider three responses to the problem of fatalism and climate anxiety that I'm trying to think through. I'm trying to work out how well they apply or not. We're going to look at Jem Bendell, Martha Nussbaum, and Spinoza. Okay, so we'll start by thinking about what is climate anxiety. I apologize for bringing out any anxiety in you as I do this. I'll just bring this up. This is a very recent one. I think this is from September this year, the Northern California wildfires. Okay, so what is climate anxiety? Sometimes this condition is known as eco-anxiety. Now, as a term itself, climate anxiety is first used by sustainability academics from around the year 2007. But it is from around the year 2017 that the term enters wider currency. I'll give a little bit more background on this in a second. I'm going to proceed with a definition that's given in a recent article on climate anxiety published in the Lancet Medical Journal in September this year by Judy Wu and others. Gives us a basic definition that we can use. And that is, quote, anxiety related to the global climate crisis and the threat of environmental disaster. It's pretty simple, but it tells us what we need to know. Now, in a 2017 guide to climate anxiety, the American Psychological Association described this condition as a chronic fear of environmental doom. It's kind of like a circular definition in a way, but leaving that aside. The Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht has proposed the term solastalgia, combining the word solace and nostalgia, referring to where one's, quote, endemic sense of place is being violated. First, for Albrecht, climate anxiety is, quote, the distress that is produced by environmental change, impacting on people while they are directly connected to their home environment. Now, in the Lancet Medical Journal, thinking about this from almost a more therapeutic perspective, the symptoms included with climate anxiety include panic attacks, insomnia, and obsessive thinking. There are also concerns that it may exacerbate existing conditions like depression, anxiety, obviously, and substance use disorders. So mental health studies across the developed world, from Australia to Greenland to the United States to the UK, indicate rising numbers of people reporting, we might say self-reporting, stress or depression related to the climate. The topic has received prominent coverage in so many major news outlets, CNN, Time Magazine, to the BBC, The Guardian, New York Times. Sometimes it's in this context of the ethics of whether we should bring children into this world, given the apparent likelihood that in several decades everything might end. We're going to think about this narrative in a moment. Above all, the condition is frequently diagnosed loosely in the young. So a BBC survey of 2,000 children aged between 8 and 16 years old this year found that nearly 1 in 5 were having nightmares about climate change, and around 3 in 4 are worried about the state of the planet right now. Now, in the Lancet, where the paper's kind of focused on the effect on young people, it highlights that climate anxiety is most likely to affect those aged between 10 and 25. You probably think of the obvious reasons, that these young folk will be, they will live long enough to witness the effects of cascading ecological collapse. But the Lancet also gives the example of Greta Thunberg and school climate strikers as kind of making this a kind of youth issue. But I would say, another kind of caution, the underlying themes of unpredictability, uncontrollability, the lethal threat and decades of inaction and frustration around this, they affect all of us. So we shouldn't think of this as a youth malady. In fact, we should actually question this age of anxiety description. Let me just bring, this is Kate Shapira, a poet who offers climate anxiety counseling in Rhode Island. Some of you might know that living in an, quote, age of anxiety is not a new thing. The poet W.H. Auden used the term to describe his society in the late 1940s, describing then an alienated world of industrialization, bureaucracy, and a lost sense of meaning. I was also thinking about the fear of nuclear war. So in 1986 publication by the US Institute of Medicine on the medical implications of nuclear war, think about the mid-1980s where this is kind of build up again, observed a not dissimilar sense of widespread fear and helplessness among young people about another seemingly looming and kind of rational apocalypse. So to my mind, climate anxiety differs from these previous forms of anxiety in two ways. First, the universally agreed existential threat of climate change, whose evidence and catastrophic effects become more evident with each year, particularly with more spectacular forest fires, floods, coral reef die-offs, receding polar ice, and all the things that we see and which frighten us. And we need to talk about that fear too. Second, the complexity of allocating responsibility or simple countermeasures. I think this is kind of touched on in Graham's paper too in a different way. So whereas chances of nuclear war could be reduced by weapons treaties between two organized superpowers, the causes of climate change seem to implicate all of us. Let me bring up this image of San Francisco, which some of you may have seen this year too, from September. So for Professor Susan Clayton, one of the contributors to the American Psychological Association report on climate anxiety, quote, the psychological responses to climate change, such as conflict avoidance, fatalism, fear, helplessness, and resignation are growing. This is the paradox that I'm going to get to. But she also adds, paradoxically, quote continues, these responses are keeping us from properly addressing the core causes of and solutions for our changing climate, and from building and supporting psychological resiliency. So it's this paradox that I want to highlight, and this is something that I'm really thinking through. It's the thing that's really getting to me. That when we explore and confront a shared global threat of great significance and of universally agreed provenance, hopefully you won't challenge this, we encounter a debilitating anxiety that diminishes our capacity to act. Where action is needed, we cannot act because we are impaired by a feeling of learned helplessness, that we are powerless to influence events beyond our control. So this is a problem not simply for climate change activism, but to my mind, to traditional accounts of individual personal autonomy more broadly. Consideration of what it means to be autonomous, that is self-governing, have often focused on the internal account of agency, like the will or free will that initiates action from within, this which reflects our capacity to act. So I guess I have in mind Kant here, and I'm just really, what I'm doing in this presentation is giving a somewhat superficial gloss over different positions in order to kind of give you a sense of what my thinking is. For Immanuel Kant, writing in the groundwork to the metaphysics of morals, autonomy is the subject's effective self-imposition of a universalizable moral law above their own hypothetical or personal considerations. So beneath this problem is a problem of epistemology, which is how do we recognize this universalizable moral law? And then there's that problem of agency that I'm hovering around. This is our capacity to act according to such a law, or say according to such a knowledge of a certain threat, and the internal and external factors that can impair this capacity. I'm not going to pretend that Kant isn't aware of the problem of fatalism. He is, he has a lot of interesting things to say about fate, but I just want to bring this as a kind of context on traditional approaches. So climate anxiety, to my mind, falls under what impairs this capacity to act. Neither short-term self-interest nor hypothetical interests explain its genesis, but the sheer scale and complexity of the problem. Okay, so that's like the end of my first part, my climate anxiety context. And in the second part, we're going to enter the workshop and look somewhat briefly at 3 different approaches to this problem of climate anxiety and fatalism. Beginning with Jem Bendell, an approach influential with Extinction Rebellion, And then from there, we're going to get to Martha Nussbaum briefly, and then to the philosopher Spinoza, who is the main area I work on, and I'll say a bit about him too. Okay, so discussions of climate anxiety in youth have sometimes cited, alongside the activism of Greta Thunberg, a 2018 paper by Jem Bendell, a professor in climate sustainability at the University of Cumbria, titled Deep Adaptation, a Map for Navigating Climate Tragedy. Now, the premise of this paper, again, many of you may have read this already. It's a it's a deeply disquieting paper. That's kind of how I'm using it here. Is to encourage readers to reconsider their lives and work in, quote, the face of an inevitable near-term social collapse due to climate change. The paper gives a substantial, I would say persuasive account of recent studies of climate change to back up its emphasis on collapse and grief. In this, it's somewhat reminiscent of the work of David Wallace Wells, author of a similarly pessimistic and widely circulated analysis of the uninhabitable Earth that came out in New York Magazine in 2017. So you remember earlier I said 2017-18 at this period where climate anxiety as a concept enters currency. I would put these as landmarks. Now, Jem Bendell calls on readers to accept and grieve for this inevitable collapse. And for him, this is necessary. It's a precondition to clear-sighted adaptation, the deep adaptation. And what he means by deep adaptation is something that isn't just about the usual kind of activism and sense of urgency about the possibility of changing things, but almost giving up on the possibility of saving many aspects of our society and world. He talks in particular about the concept of relinquishment, letting go, and resilience, which you might remember was used by Susan Clayton as well. Again, I'm just going to drop this in really briefly. There are echoes of this approach in Extinction Rebellion and in their kind of promotional campaign literature around the necessity of first grieving for the society, our society that will soon be lost. But I mean, it's hard to be lighthearted about this. This is from Vice magazine. At this point, this is in February 2019, the paper had been downloaded by 100,000 people, which if you're an academic like me, would be an absolute dream if anybody downloaded so many of my papers. Jem Bendell says actually since 2020, I'm guessing this is late 2020, he says over 1 million have downloaded this paper. Now, to my mind, Bendell's deep adaptation approach is insufficient for the problem of motivation necessary for the capacity to act on two levels. So I'm just going to present this fairly briefly. So firstly, in taking collapse as a given, it does not focus action on the opportunities for transforming the economic and political structures responsible for increasing carbon emissions. This is not an original criticism that I'm making, by the way, but we just need to flag it up. Second, and this is more my kind of position, without a pre-existing faith in the efficacy of street activism or community activism in Bendell's case, such bleak prognoses reinforce a sense of powerlessness. We kind of get that in the Vice article. Many reading this and they're not feeling compelled to form resilient communities. They're thinking, fuck. So in the end, climate anxiety comes to reflect the Anthropocene. We know this term. It's something, a geological era shaped by humanity, in a way shaped by human nature, something inherently greedy or aggressive. But I think that we should think about climate anxiety in terms of industrial capitalism in a specific historical political configuration, the capital OC. Again, I'm not being original here. I'm just saying this is my kind of context. So a second approach then. This is something different because Martha Nussbaum, a prolific American philosopher, doesn't talk about climate change in The Monarchy of Fear. Now, this is a book that comes out in 2018, and really it's about Donald Trump. It's written in response to the election of Donald Trump. And she uses this to kind of think about Trump's tendencies towards anger and disgust and the way that he amplifies these in his supporters. Now, Martha Nussbaum observes, not controversially, but interestingly, quote, many Americans feel themselves powerless, out of control of their own lives. They fear that the American dream, that hope that your children will flourish and do even better than you have done, has died, end quote. So Nussbaum grounds these economic concerns early on, but her main interest is how they exacerbate an existing vulnerability that we all have for showing or withdrawing moral concern to others, and that's fear. You might be thinking here, what's the difference between fear and anxiety? I'm not going to comment on it now. No, I should. Fear traditionally is the perceived threat of something specific, whereas anxiety is not a specific perceived threat, but a more kind of general state of concern. Okay, this is off my head, so I could probably do better in the Q&A. Martha Nussbaum's analysis partly rests on child psychology, particularly that of the British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. The problem with fear or feeling powerless, be it in toddlers for Winnicott or adults, is that it compels us towards wanting to regain control. And for Martha Nussbaum, to embrace leaders who make us feel safe and then blame minorities for the perceived threat. Nussbaum says that fear drives out all thoughts of others. And she uses this idea of the perceived threat to think about how our sense of obligation is limited. When we are afraid, we focus on our own bodies, on ourselves. But I think this is intriguing because it's really different to climate anxiety in a sense. Because if that's not necessarily just kind of future self-focus, it's often in the context of future harm to our loved ones, even unborn children. Now, Nussbaum's context is Donald Trump and so on. Now, the task in her work is to gain what she calls moral adulthood through a capacity for concern to others in our society. And for Winnicott and the child analogy, it's a toddler who stops being aggressive and biting their parent and losing their temper, but they recognize that the parent is an object of love. And so they manage to overcome aggression and they care. So that's the kind of the hope. And what Nussbaum does with this is she prescribes what I would say, don't want to criticize her too much because I think she is one of my most important intellectual resources, but she prescribes a somewhat bland tonic for the body politic. I'll quote, correct facts, informed public debate, and most important, a spirit of dissent and independence on the part of citizens. This is what she prescribes against an era of polarization, fake news, and fear. And there's great important grounds for that. But again, it doesn't tackle economic factors like insecurity and poverty, or social factors that might not affect the working class but the middle class, like relative decline in status, perceived relative decline in status. Now, some fears can be rational. I think climate change is one. Mass extinctions are some of the things that Graham mentioned are enough. Nuclear war is a rational fear. Not all fears inevitably lead to an aggressive desire to control against Nussbaum, nor do all fears inevitably lead to a wish to lash out at perceived harm. So to my mind, Nussbaum's analysis does not account for learned helplessness, particularly in deindustrialized areas. And I'm thinking here of works like J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, or the work of the American sociologist Jennifer Silver. So nor does the emphasis on restoring a liberal public sphere, like pre-2000, confront, for our problem at least, an entrenched global capitalism where extraction, production, banking, finance, and so on is increasingly offshore. Again, I'm not being totally original here. I'm just presenting a web of problems. So like any classic historian of philosophy, I'm going to present my guy as the solution to everything. Baruch Spinoza, a 17th century Dutch philosopher and lens grinder whose major work, The Ethics, explores the conditions for human freedom. Now in Spinoza's era, very different to ours, human mastery of nature, Prometheanism, and the mechanical extraction of its resources were virtues, not vices. Again, a different world. But his account rests heavily on a human psychology of the affects or emotions, which so often take the active steer in our judgments or desires. His work often returns to the influence of hope and fear on our decisions. Now, for Spinoza, and he's influenced here by the Roman Stoics like Seneca, hope and fear are two sides of the same coin, they're complementary. They describe, quote, an inconstant joy, that's hope, or an inconstant sadness, that's fear, arising from the image of a thing, future or past, of whose outcome we are in doubt. Now, for Spinoza, hopes and fears arise in response to the adversity we inevitably experience in the pursuit of our desires. But they also diminish our capacity to act because they are rooted in uncertainty, and they answer that uncertainty with not an effort to understand its causes necessarily, but instead to fall under the spell of fantasies, paralyzing fantasies or nightmares like climate anxiety, like this uninhabitable Earth, that ultimately speak to our lack of capacity to influence events. Now, for Spinoza, he doesn't know about climate anxiety, but for Spinoza, this kind of fear and hope makes us gullible to the powerful superstitions of organized religion, of which he's a great critic, and political strongmen. And they're fundamental to tyrannical rule. At the same time, they're rooted in vulnerabilities in our human nature. So for Spinoza, to free ourselves of fear, we must also free ourselves of hope. Now, this is my kind of reading. Other Spinozas may disagree. In this, Spinoza disagrees, in my reading, markedly with Martha Nussbaum or Immanuel Kant, and he comes closer to Jem Bendell's position, except that Spinoza's ethics is far from fatalistic. Its vision of freedom rests on an autonomy achieved not solely individually, but collectively. This is my kind of original take that I'm going to try and put for sale in this piece I'm working on. Spinoza writes that, quote, nothing is more useful to a human being than another human being. And throughout his works, he presents the value of friendship and association with others of a common nature, through which our power is multiplied collectively. This is akin perhaps to what Tim described as conviviality. These communities are not based on identity or place, but on the most secure basis for agreement among all, reason and a desire to know. This desire to know leads us towards democracy, a major and untimely feature in his works, and a collective concern with peace and cooperation. For Spinoza, self-government, autonomy, occurs through democratic government then, founded on popular sovereignty, mass civic participation, the restraint of ecclesiastical power, and the public protection of philosophy. This might speak to a relational autonomy then, a feminist approach to autonomy that not as an individual quality or achievement, but as something that is embedded in our social relations and mutual interdependence. But to my mind, it also speaks often to collective autonomy, an autonomy not merely of individual choice or self-expression, but which emerges out of shared, equal economic and political power by all citizens in the polity. And I'm putting that across rather vaguely because it needs to be filled in. So how does that bear on climate anxiety then? Let me round up. I talked about growing reports of anxiety and depression among young people around the globe in response to climate change. I noted the paradox that this debilitating anxiety can diminish our capacity to act and do something about this. So I'm going to conclude with two things. First, the general literature around climate anxiety usually prescribes participating in collective action. This is something that we can do. It relieves isolation, gives us a sense of purpose, and leads to real localized changes that make a difference. We know this stuff because it's normally at the end of those op-eds on climate anxiety. But second, and my take, is that we should be cautious about the benefits of indulging hope or fear too heavily. Neither total collapse nor a technological fix are inevitable. In imagining future scenarios where action is out of our hands, we reinforce our learned helplessness and fatalism in the present. But faith in simply a political fix, like a change in government or a citizens' assembly, also reduces the attention on the work each of us needs to do to address climate change in our lives. My working proposal, this is the final sentence, is that we shift our attention from the autonomy of the individual, as per ethical consumption, towards the autonomy of the collective, of shared, equal economic and political power by all. So thanks very much. Thank you.